Greetings, everyone. My name is Tom Kahn. I am the proud board member and policy committee chair of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, and we are thrilled to have you join us today. Thank you to the hundreds of you joining us via Zoom and the many more tuning in on C-SPAN. I think, as all of us know, after months of protests regarding the Israeli government's proposed judicial overhaul, on Monday, the Knesset enacted the first measure toward overhaul, repealing the standard used by Israeli courts to strike down unreasonableness that is on Israeli government decisions. In the past, this reasonable test has served as a vital check and balance on executive overreach, and it has allowed the Supreme Court of Israel to protect minority rights and prevent corruption. It's been a critical part of the checks and balances that we in America understand is so important. And JDCA has opposed the current government's proposed judicial overhaul, as well as the passage of this bill, and we are gravely concerned about the future of Israel's democracy. JDCA remains deeply committed to the safety and security of the state of Israel, very deeply committed to it, and its future, as well as a Jewish and a democratic state. And at the same time, we are very worried about ongoing attempts to erode Israel's democracies with measures like this one, which unequivocally weaken Israel's courts, democracy, and the system of checks and balances. We're worried about what will happen next. Will there be new pieces of legislation that will be enacted by the Knesset? Will actions be taken against the Attorney General or other actions that we can't even predict? And as this troubling process of judicial overhaul continues, we wanted to make sure that JDCA members understand the facts. So today, we are going to unpack the judicial overhaul changes we have seen so far, their impact, and what the future may hold. And we have an absolutely superb panel to present with us today. Joining us for this critical conversation is Amir Tibon, who is diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz. Amir has been with Haaretz since 2017, where he covered the Trump campaign, the administration, Charlottesville, and the Tree of Life shooting as their Washington correspondent. We are also really lucky today to be joined by my good friend and colleague, Michael Koplow, Chief Policy Officer at Israel Policy Forum. Michael also serves as a senior research fellow at the Kogard Research Center at the Shalom Hartman Institute. And before coming to IPF, he was the founding program director of the Israel Institute. I just want to thank Michael and Amir. Thank you so much for this Friday afternoon in Washington, this hot Washington afternoon, for your agreeing to spend valuable time with us. And at this point, I would like to turn it over to our moderator, JDCA's CEO, Haley Sofer.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thanks to Amir and Michael for being with us today. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. Let's get right at it. So earlier this week, as Tom said, the Knesset passed a bill to overturn the reasonableness standard. So this is a question, our first question for you, Amir and Michael. What is this standard, and what are the practical implications of its repeal? Additionally, what are the larger implications in terms of the future of Israel as a democracy? Amir, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you, Haley. Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. Michael, it's great to see you, my friend. And thanks to everyone who joined in order to understand what's happening here. There's a lot of drama, so we'll really do our best. As for the law that was passed this week, the reasonableness standard is a tool that the Israeli legal system, it started with the Supreme Court, but was also used sometimes by lower courts, has used over the years as a way to conduct judicial review over governmental decisions. This does not have to do with legislation, but executive decisions of the government. And it was used quite rarely, I have to say, not very often, but it was used in order to strike down certain government decisions that the court ruled were extremely unreasonable. I'll give one example that's very close to home and to heart for me. Those of you who maybe have met me before or know me, will know that my home in Israel is in a small kibbutz on the Israeli border with Gaza, kibbutz Nahal Oz. It's actually officially the closest place in Israel to the Gaza Strip. In 2007, there was a governmental decision at the time Ehud Olmert was prime minister to provide bomb shelters for all the schools and the kindergartens in this area of Israel. But after that decision was made, there was a more lower level bureaucratic decision that this could not be implemented because of a lack of funding. A resident from our area, the Gaza border area of Israel, appealed to the Supreme Court of Israel and asked the Supreme Court to use the reasonableness standard to overturn this government decision, arguing that it was extremely unreasonable not to provide adequate and sufficient protection to children who live on the Gaza border. And the Supreme Court intervened. And yes, it said it was extremely unreasonable for the government not to provide shelter for school children in my area of Israel. And eventually the government had to implement its own policy decision and provide the funding in order to protect the lives of children in this area. Now, this is, I think, an example that is very easy to understand and less perhaps politically explosive than a more recent use of the reasonableness standard by the Supreme Court about half a year ago, when the Supreme Court ruled by a majority of 10-1 that Aryeh Deri, the leader of the ultra-Orthodox Shas party, which is an important member of Benjamin Netanyahu's current right-wing religious coalition, cannot serve as a minister in the Israeli government because it was extremely unreasonable to appoint a man who has twice been found guilty of crimes and who had recently promised to leave politics as part of a plea deal, that it was extremely unreasonable to appoint this man to be Israel's Minister of the Interior and Minister of Health. He was supposed to hold both positions. And basically, as a result of that decision, Deri was fired from the government. And so what the government did this week, it passed a law that cancels the reasonableness standard and says that the court can no longer use this standard as a way to conduct judicial review over executive governmental decisions. Now, I have to say, I'll give just one more sentence, which is a bit more of a personal opinion. I tried so far just to provide the facts. I have to say that for me personally, and for a lot of other people who oppose the law that was passed this week, there is an understanding that the reasonableness standard comes with some difficulties. It's a bit opaque. It's not enough clearly defined in legislation. And I was hoping when the government initially said that they were going to do a judicial reform, that one of the things they would do is to fix and clearly define the borders of the reasonableness standard, how it could be applied, where it could be used, where it couldn't be used. That would have been a very good step, and I would have applauded this government if they did it. But what they did instead is they canceled altogether the court's ability to use this tool against corrupt and extremely unreasonable decisions. And I think this is a characteristic of their judicial overhaul in a wider sense. On each and every issue where there is a problem that needs to be fixed in the Israeli judicial system, instead of offering a moderate, middle-of-the-road, reasonable, sensible solution to an existing controversy, they go with the most extreme possible suggestion. And we can maybe talk about the next bills that they're planning to give examples of that, but certainly on the reasonableness standard. Instead of saying, okay, there's something here that needs to be more clearly defined, they just came and canceled it altogether. And by doing that, removed a very critical tool that the court had to supervise and conduct judicial review over extremely unreasonable government decisions.
Thank you, Tamir. So, Michael, if you could speak to what the implications are for the future of Israel's democracy.
Of course. So thank you, Haley and Tom, and to JDCA, and always great to be alongside my friend Amir. So I want to pick up on what Amir finished with, which is the way in which the Israeli government, in many ways, took almost the broadest possible version of eliminating the reasonableness standard. There are different ways that the Israeli government could have approached it. The reasonableness standard, because Israel has no constitution, is really one of the only ways in which the courts can check government action, right? We're not talking here about legislation. We're not talking about laws that are passed by the Knesset. We're talking about actions that are taken by either the Israeli government, the cabinet, or by individual ministers. And there are different ways in which reasonableness could have been approached, and in line with the notion that the reasonableness standard needs reform. The way in which the government did it was to say that the Supreme Court not only has no oversight over actions taken by the cabinet, it has no oversight in terms of reasonableness over actions taken by individual ministers. It also now no longer has the power to intervene either in policy decisions or in decisions surrounding appointments. And it also doesn't have the power to compel the government to act in instances in which it refuses to act. And this has implications going forward. Amir talked about Aryeh Deri and how the reasonableness standard was used to prevent him from being appointed a minister. Prime Minister Netanyahu just yesterday announced in an interview that he intends to reappoint Aryeh Deri to the cabinet. But it isn't simply about appointments. There's something right now going on, which also has to do with the judicial overhaul, which is Justice Minister Yariv Levin's refusal to convene the Judicial Selection Committee, which populates the judges for every single court in Israel. Under the old reasonableness standard, the Supreme Court would have been able to say to Yariv Levin, it's extremely unreasonable that you won't convene the committee. It means that judges cannot be appointed at any level of Israel's court system, not the magistrate court, not the district court, and not the Supreme Court. And you must convene this committee. But now there's no mechanism for doing that. And so when we think about something like the practical implications for Israeli democracy, even in the short term, where there already is a shortage of judges, the idea that these courts are going to be left empty because the justice minister is simply unwilling to convene the committee that has to select all the judges, that's something that can no longer be remedied, given that the reasonableness standard is now gone. And so this is a very broad action that they took. I also want to note that many of the cases that the reasonableness standard, or actions to which the reasonableness standard has applied, have been cited by folks on the right as things that were beneficial to the left. But there's another famous instance in which the reasonableness standard was applied, when there was a town inside of Israel that did not want to build a mikvah, a ritual bath, for its religious residents. And despite the fact that the land had been set aside, despite the fact that the Religious Services Ministry had the money to build the mikvah, the ritual bath, the municipality decided that it didn't want more religious Jews, and so it decided not to build it. That was an instance in which the Supreme Court stepped in and said, this is an extremely unreasonable decision. And so this is a standard that has really protected folks across the spectrum, left and right, religious and secular. And eliminating it is absolutely going to have consequences going forward, not only for Israeli individuals, but also for the overall Israeli system, where now an individual minister can decide to even discriminate against individuals with any sort of action, and there is very little recourse to prevent that from happening. So when we think about the health of any democracy, and we think about the way in which checks and balances have to exist, this makes that very difficult going forward, certainly when it comes to government action.
Thank you. Well, we know that this was just one part of the current Israeli government's broad plans for judicial overhaul. So what comes next? You both mentioned some possible steps that may come next, but what do you believe will come next, and on what timeline? What happens if the Israeli Supreme Court deems this law unreasonable? Will there be essentially a constitutional crisis without a constitution? And specifically, what additional measures should we expect in the next few months? We could start with you, Michael.
So let's start with the question about what happens if the Supreme Court decides to strike this down, because I think in many ways that will dictate what happens next. There are a number of paths in which the Supreme Court can take, and they have accepted a petition against the reasonableness law, and that's going to be heard in September. And given that Supreme Court Justice President Esther Chayut is going to be retiring in October. I'm relatively certain that whatever decision they render will come down in October. So on the one hand, the Supreme Court could certainly strike down the entire reasonableness law. They could also elect to allow it to go through as is. They can take a middle ground, and if we're going to be predicting things, that's what I would predict. They can also take a middle ground where they let it stand, but they narrow it so that it perhaps only applies to decisions of the full cabinet, but not decisions of individual ministers, or they might make a distinction between policy decisions and appointments of ministers and deputy ministers. There are different ways in which they could preserve the law, but or preserve the new law, but narrow it. But because the reasonableness law was passed as an amendment to the basic law in the judiciary, I suspect that if the Supreme Court does anything to strike down any part of the law or all of the law, the next move, and this is part of Yariv Levin's initial conception of the judicial overhaul, I think the next move is going to be to eliminate the Israeli Supreme Court's oversight of basic laws, which serve as a quasi-constitution. There's been a lot of focus on the Judicial Selection Committee because that is the thing that the government and the coalition prioritized from the beginning. It's also the thing that has been the most controversial. But I think that if the Supreme Court strikes down an amendment to a basic law, which is something that the Supreme Court has never done, they've heard challenges to them, but have never struck them down, then it's going to provide the logical opening for Netanyahu to say, you know, this is outrageous. We passed an amendment to a basic law. This has constitutional status, and it's outrageous that the Supreme Court can strike it down. And I think that that's what they will then move to next. If for some reason the Supreme Court allows this to go through untouched, then it may be that Judicial Selection Committee happens first. But I think it's more likely that the next thing that goes is oversight over basic laws. And I'll just end by saying that Prime Minister Netanyahu, in one of the interviews that he gave yesterday to various American outlets, he was asked about this, and he compared the Supreme Court potentially striking down the reasonableness law because it was an amendment to a basic law as the U.S. Supreme Court declaring a constitutional amendment unconstitutional. And he said, nobody would ever let that stand. So I think that that's a preview of perhaps what we're going to see once this makes its way through the court in September and October.
And Amir, in addition to that question, I also want to ask how you believe this will be, what will be the response of the Israeli people to this? I mean, this weekend will be the 29th consecutive week of mass protests, hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the street. And do you believe that this will continue in response, or will the protest movement, will they be deflated by what's occurred?
That is the million-dollar question, really, Haley. I was in Jerusalem on Monday when there were these massive protests in front of the Knesset. I wanted to go and see it with my own eyes. And there were tens of thousands of people there. And I have to say, that energy is not going to disappear. These people are not going to just go back home and close the door. They have a sense that right now it's either fight or flight. It's either fighting for the character of Israel and averting this grand plan to weaken the only institution in our system that serves as a check on the power of the government, which is the Supreme Court. And of course, that is not just, in order to create a new constitutional order. That is being done in order to change everything that is happening in this country in terms of religion and state, civil rights, human rights. The people pushing forward this judicial overhaul are not doing it because they have some kind of philosophical view of the balance of power between the authorities. They're doing it because they view the Supreme Court of Israel as a liberalizing force in Israeli society. I know that in the United States, there is a big debate right now about the current conservative majority on your Supreme Court. But here in Israel, historically, the Supreme Court has served as a liberalizing force in our society. A lot of the progress that Israel has made in recent decades, and that we as Israelis take pride in and like to showcase to the world on issues like women's rights and LGBT rights and more equality for the Arab minority. A lot of that progress has actually come through landmark decisions of the Supreme Court. And the ultra-religious far-right forces in Netanyahu's government want to weaken the court because they want a different Israel. They want an Israel that will be much more religious, much less liberal, much less free, with less equality for minorities and for women, and less rights for LGBT. And so the people out there in the streets fighting against this new vision for Israel and fighting to preserve the checks and balances that exist today, where the Supreme Court can still strike down legislation that will harm people's rights, they view it as a battle that cannot be lost, because losing basically means having no future here, having to immigrate out of this country and find a different home, and giving up on Israel. And when the choice people envision before themselves is fight or immigrate, and immigration is a very difficult thing to do, even though the segment of the Israeli population that is most represented in these protests is overwhelmingly highly educated and comes from the more affluent and more you know, kind of, I mean, people, you know, a lot of them in the high-tech sector and things like that. Still, moving to another country is never an easy thing to do. And so people are determined to fight. And I don't think the protest movement is going to lose steam because of this. I don't think people are going to give up. If anything, I believe that right now it is the government that is having a very difficult dilemma. The government just passed the first component of this judicial overhaul. They wanted in the beginning to do a series of very harsh measures that will be presented all at once, including what Michael mentioned, changing the composition of the committee that selects judges to give an automatic majority to the government. So basically the government could select all the judges in Israel, which maybe to American ears doesn't sound in the beginning so crazy. But then I just want to remind you that in your system, the president nominates the judges, but the Senate has to approve them. And in the Senate, first of all, a lot of times the party that holds the majority is not the party of the president. And second thing, even when the party of the president has a majority, each and every senator is responsible for their own vote and will eventually have to stand up to the voters in their state and justify, for example, why they allowed the president in a theoretical scenario to allow his to nominate his daughter or his son to be on the Supreme Court. Okay, here in Israel, the members of the Knesset are much less independent than your senators. They are not elected directly by the people. Israelis don't vote for members of the Knesset, they vote for party lists. And it's the leaders of the parties that control these party lists. And so the members of the Knesset, if an extremely unreasonable judicial appointment is being offered by the government, most likely it will be approved in a scenario where the government selects the judges by itself, like what this government wants to do. So that's one component. In addition, they want to significantly weaken the legal advisors in the Israeli cabinet ministry. These are professional career appointments, people whose job is to help clarify to the entire executive branch by ministries the boundaries of the law and what kind of decisions are legal or illegal and would stand up or not stand up in court. And if you weaken their status, you also open up the door to a lot of corrupt actions and a lot of, let's say, actions that are in the gray zone of legality, that in today's system, there would be a warning sign from the legal advisors and it would not be pursued. But the dilemma for the government right now is they just passed this one component, the reasonableness standard, and they ran into very intense and I think surprising to them opposition from the Israeli public. Haley, you mentioned the protests. 30 weeks in a row it's going to be now of people out in the streets, sometimes also in the middle of the week coming out to demonstrate. And we're talking about the crisis within the military, which I think is the scariest component for the government. When you have thousands of reservists in different units, including combat pilots, people in the special forces, people in the key intelligence and cyber units who are saying, we signed a contract with a democratic state of Israel. We will not serve in a non-democratic state of Israel. And so you have to stop the legislation now. And I'm hearing, this is out in the news today in Israel, already several lawmakers and ministers from Likud basically saying, we will no longer support legislation that does not enjoy a broad consensus. Now, a grain of salt on this, it could be a tactical maneuver. It could be, kind of a ploy to basically tell Netanyahu, reach compromise with the opposition, but then Netanyahu will come with an unreasonable a compromise offer that the opposition will not agree to because it will be a total joke. And then these members of Likud will turn around and say, well, sorry, we tried to find a compromise. So I think the protest movement is not going to slow down right now. It's going to increase the pressure in the hope that eventually that pressure does lead to some kind of a crack up within Likud and enough lawmakers saying, we are not going to support this kind of one-sided extreme legislation anymore.
Okay, thank you, Amir. Michael, turning back to Washington, this has been a big few weeks in terms of the relationship with Israel. We had President Herzog visit and address a joint session of Congress. He was very well received. The President Biden had a conversation with the Prime Minister and urged him to move toward consensus, that there should be the broadest possible consensus for any reforms, and that shared democratic values have always been and must remain a hallmark of the U.S.-Israel relationship. So how do you assess the Biden administration's policy vis-a-vis Israel as judicial overhaul has been both previewed and now as it's transpired? Has the administration been forceful enough? And also, how do you characterize the response of Congress?
I think that the administration and Congress don't have lots of good options here. And that's for a number of reasons. First of all, there is a lot of conflation between issues around judicial overhaul and issues surrounding other Israeli activity, including in the West Bank. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to take disagreements over Israeli policy in the West Bank and turn them into disagreements over judicial overhaul. So, for instance, there's a debate about cutting or conditioning security assistance to Israel, something that I'm not in favor of, irrespective of what's taking place in the West Bank. I think that there are far better ways to address Israeli behavior with regard to a 56-year occupation. But even if you're someone who is in favor of that approach, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me to take that and say, this is an issue we have with Israel's occupation of the West Bank. Let's use that as a lever over something like judicial overhaul. So, that's one problem. The other problem is that Amir talked about the Israelis who are demonstrating in the streets, and I agree with him that I think the demonstrations are going to continue, and I think in many ways they're going to pick up steam. I think that there are going to be more levers of pressure that the leaders of the protests bring to bear on the government. There were calls yesterday for things like tax revolts, and there's obviously the ongoing IDF reservist crisis. But the United States doesn't have those same types of levers that it can pull, even if it wanted to. And so salvation, when it comes to judicial overhaul, I don't think is going to come from the United States. The administration has, I think, done what it can to try to persuade Prime Minister Netanyahu that he is taking the wrong course. This has happened in a number of ways. There have obviously been many statements from the president, from the Secretary of State, from spokespeople in the administration, from members of Congress. Those warnings, which have almost all been friendly warnings, were disregarded by the Prime Minister, as is his right to do. But that means that the United States can keep on issuing even more forceful statements. It doesn't seem like those are likely to make a difference, or they're likely to break through. Something that I think that the administration has done, and I think it's been effective, but it requires keeping the strategy up, has been to use the role of the United States in Israeli politics to our advantage. What that means is that for not only the Prime Minister, but for many Israeli politicians, the relationship with the US isn't simply about strategic interests. It's not simply about military assistance. It's not simply about projecting that the United States has Israel's back in the region, it's also a very potent political tool at home. There's a reason that before the first election in this recent 5-election cycle in Israel, that Prime Minister Netanyahu ran on the slogan of Liga Haaretz, in a different league, with large pictures of him with President Trump, also large pictures of him with Vladimir Putin. I don't think that he would do either of those today. But the point is that he was running on his relationship with the United States, and this idea that he alone has the ability to have incredible access to American decision makers and to come to the United States and be respected and be able to stand up for Israel. I think it's entirely appropriate that President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu talk as often as possible, as often as is warranted. But having Prime Minister Netanyahu come to the United States and visit the president at the White House and have an Oval Office meeting and all of the photo ops that go along with that, that's a huge political gift for a prime minister who at the moment is disregarding what the United States would like to see, not only on judicial overhaul, but on a host of other issues. I think that if President Biden indeed hosts Prime Minister Netanyahu in the Oval Office in the fall, it will be a mistake, and it will be throwing away much of the leverage that has been built up. And I think that if the U.S. continues to understand that the role of the United States has enormous political impact inside of Israel, then perhaps over time we can start to get Prime Minister Netanyahu and other folks in the Israeli government a little bit more over towards where we want them to be. The other thing that I'll say is that there's a huge opportunity sitting out there that is not a stick but a carrot, and that's Israel-Saudi normalization. This is something that Israel wants very badly. It can only happen with the United States. It can only happen if the United States is willing to broker it. It can only happen if the United States is willing to make some sort of concessions to Saudi Arabia, since reportedly all of the asks from the Saudis are things that they want from the US rather than from Israel. There's a whole angle to this on the Israeli-Palestinian front, and perhaps we'll talk about that later, or perhaps that's for another webinar on another day. But I think the point here is that for an Israel-Saudi deal to go through, particularly with any Palestinian component, it's almost impossible to see how it happens with the current Israeli government. And while Prime Minister Netanyahu is obviously the face associated with the judicial overhaul, in many ways he is being pushed by his coalition partners. And I think that while judicial overhaul will not be the subject of any Israel-Saudi normalization, there may be an ancillary benefit in that if such a deal can happen, and it has a real significant Palestinian component, as it should, that may mean that Israeli voters and Israeli politicians will be faced with a choice, which is stick with the current government or go with a different one. And I think that any different government, whether it comes about through Prime Minister Netanyahu switching up his coalition on his own or through elections, any different government is unlikely to push judicial overhaul and push some of the more problematic aspects for Israeli democracy in the same way that this one is. And so I think that there is this big opportunity out there to do a number of things on a number of fronts, and judicial overhaul may be one of those fronts that can be impacted in a positive way.
Great, thank you. Amir, a similar question, but from the Israeli perspective. Obviously, concerns about judicial overhaul have not only been expressed by the Biden administration, by members of Congress, but also by Jewish American organizations, including JDCA. How do these concerns, including those of American Jews, but also separately of the US government, impact what's happening in Israel? Or does it matter at all to this Israeli government? And I also want to pick up on something that Michael talked about in terms of the relationship between Netanyahu and Biden. If you could speak to that as well. I heard you recently on Pod Save the World speaking about how the Prime Minister has leveraged his relationship with US presidents in the past 3 terms. So 2 questions.
Yeah. Sure, no, but they're closely related. I think for the average Israeli, 2 things really matter. Number 1 is what President Biden has to say, and number 2, what members of Congress have to say. Unfortunately, we at Haaretz cover extensively what is being said in the American Jewish community. We see it as a priority We believe that the American Jewish community is critical for Israel because there's only one Jewish state and only one Jewish community outside of it with millions of people, right? All the other communities, you know, we also love our brothers and sisters in the UK and France and everywhere. But the American Jewish community is the most important Jewish community in the world outside of Israel. So we write about it all the time, and our readers understand why it matters. I think to the average Israeli, the people who don't necessarily read Haaretz, it's really all about Biden, and it's a lot about members of Congress and senators, because there is an understanding that without their support, Israel cannot get what it wants in Washington. But I do want to say something about why I believe what the most important thing actually is what the American Jewish community says and does. The most important thing. Because for President Biden to come out against this legislation again and again, in a phone call to the prime minister and in a conversation with Tom Friedman and in statements to the press and official remarks by the White House spokesperson, time after time, to stand up for Israeli democracy, he's opening himself up to attacks from the Republican side, that he's intervening in internal affairs of Israel, meddling, attacking Netanyahu. The same is true for members of Congress and senators, but of course, if more members of Congress and senators speak out about this and say that as friends of Israel, as lovers of Israel, they are very worried and maybe even more than worried, enraged, saddened, of course, that would give more space to Biden. But without the voice of the American Jewish community, all of this becomes much more complicated, right? If the American Jewish community is ahead of Biden on this issue and basically takes a stronger stand than the president, and it's Jewish American leaders who are calling Netanyahu and telling him, what you're doing here is dangerous, it's disastrous, it's putting our support in question, then it's much more difficult for Republicans to attack Biden for standing up for democracy and the rule of law in Israel. And so I think the support of the American Jewish community, maybe to a person who's sitting and reading about this in Rishon LeZion, or in anywhere in Israel, is not that critical, but it has a very important role in creating a more supportive atmosphere for Biden to step in and speak about this and continue his very important role so far in pointing out the difficulties that this legislation could present to the US-Israel relationship. Now, I have to say, Joe Biden, this is not just how I view him, but this is how people in the Israeli government, including this government, who've worked with him, describe him. He's a Zionist. Okay, this man loves the state of Israel and has a deep connection to it and understands the concerns and the security priorities of Israel, and has supported Israel time and again during his career. And what he's doing these days, when he's speaking up about the dangers of this legislation, could perhaps be the most important pro-Israeli chapter of his career. And he's done some things with Israel, right? He likes to point out that he's known every prime minister since the days of Golda Meir. But if he continues with his current insistence that this legislation hurts the shared values that are one of the most important pillars of the US-Israel relationship, and by the way, I believe this legislation also hurts US interests. It's not just about values. The Supreme Court in Israel over the years has played a very important role, unfortunately, as kind of a babysitter for all kinds of populist and extremist politicians. Netanyahu, as prime minister, before he became a criminal defendant and then changed his entire approach to the judicial system and became much more hostile to it. But before that happened, if you go back, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, Netanyahu was always very supportive of the judicial system and opposed all kinds of initiatives from the right to weaken it. And why is that? Because it was very comfortable for him as prime minister to know that he could allow his right-wing religious coalition partners to put forward all kinds of crazy legislation and policies, and that the Supreme Court will eventually intervene, solve the problem, strike down all the crazy ideas, and he will just tell his partners, listen, I tried, but the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court is weakened and can no longer play the babysitter role, who will be the babysitter? It won't be Netanyahu. It will be the United States. Every crazy idea, every crazy policy decision, legislation that will not be stopped by the court, will land on the desk of the American ambassador. And if it's, the more important it is, it will rise up to the Secretary of State and maybe even the president. And that's not healthy for the US-Israel relationship. It's not healthy for US interests in the region. And I think this is another good reason for Biden to continue standing up. But I think that for him to do that without, we're entering an election year, Donald Trump is going to try to portray himself, if he's the nominee, but honestly, if it's somewhere else, if someone else of the Republican Party, just as well, will try to portray themselves as more pro-Israel and try to attack Biden. And so for Biden to have the ability to continue to stand up for Israeli democracy, the voice of the American Jewish community is critical. Without it, I think it will be more and more difficult for him. And we're in this for the long run. I mean, this issue is not going to go away in the next few months. There are some very extreme and very determined people in the Netanyahu government who want to continue with this march against the court. Biden's voice matters. The voice of Democrats in Congress matters. And the voice of the American Jewish community, again, in my opinion, matters more than anything else because it creates the terms of the conversation.
Right. Wow. JDCA will continue to use its voice and express concern. Michael, yesterday you wrote that U.S. relations will look stable in the short term, U.S.-Israel relations will look stable in the short term, but the judicial overhaul will have long-term consequences. Could you speak about those consequences and what we can expect in terms of the impact that additional steps may have in terms of overhaul measures on the U.S.-Israel relationship?
When we talk about U.S.-Israel relations, everybody knows the shtick about shared values, but it's true. It's an interest that's based on shared values, perhaps even more so than on shared interests. And what makes it different from relationships the United States has with other countries, and particularly with other countries in the Middle East, is this idea of shared values. A U.S.-Israel relationship that was based only on shared interests would still be an incredibly close, robust security and military and defense and intelligence relationship. Whatever Israel does regarding judicial overhaul, the benefits to both sides of very close security and intelligence cooperation are not going to change. What makes the U.S.-Israel relationship distinctive is the idea of shared values, and that's why you see the relationship go far beyond just the notion of shared security interests in the Middle East. When we think about things like trade missions and economic relationships between individual states and the state of Israel, when we think about efforts at the national level and at the state level against the BDS movement, when we think about all the various cultural exchanges that happen, when we think about the role that Israel even plays in popular culture, this is all a result of the idea that Americans have that Israel is a democracy, that it shares values with the US, that we have this commonality not only of interests, but this commonality of values. I think it's going to be very hard if the judicial overhaul keeps on going in the way that it has, for Americans to maintain that relatively rock-solid view that Israel and the US are similar when it comes to things like rule of law, when it comes to things like democratic accountability. And if that indeed gets eroded, and I think that it's going to be hard for it not to erode, as Americans watch Israelis in the streets month after month after month, hundreds of thousands every single week, protesting the government and warning that if the judicial overhaul goes through, Israel will be a dictatorship. Whether that's hyperbolic or not, the fact of the matter is Americans are seeing these messages and they are absorbing them. When Americans see their leaders, from the president to members of Congress, rightly, in my view, express concerns over the direction of Israeli democracy, it's going to be hard for many people to maintain this sense that the US and Israel are in the same boat. And if that happens, then all of these other soft elements of the US-Israel relationship are going to be a lot harder to sustain. And particularly for American Jews, I think what we love about the US-Israel relationship is that it's not simply a transactional security relationship. When we talk about presidents who feel Israel in their kishkas, when we talk about politicians who feel Israel in their kishkas, it's not because of security. It's based on this shared values idea. And so it's harder to point to tangible ways in which the relationship will suffer, because that's the nature of soft power versus hard power and soft elements versus hard elements. But it absolutely will be damaged. And I think if this goes through, and if an image of Israel is cemented for many Americans that is not like the Israel they thought they knew, when we talk about the US-Israel special relationship going forward, it's going to look and be a lot less special.
Thank you. Our last question for the two of you comes from Gail, and I just want to give a shout out to all of those who submitted questions. We incorporated them into our questions today. Gail's question really gets at the heart of it, and it's to what end? What is behind the government's motivations for judicial overhaul? What is the policy agenda this government hopes to advance if they succeed in fulfilling the full overhaul plans? And after 75 years of democracy, what has led to this change? Amir, we'll start with you.
So the Netanyahu coalition that is promoting this legislation to weaken the judicial system has three components. There is Netanyahu's Likud party, there is the ultra-Orthodox, and then there is the far-right, ultra-nationalists. For each of the components, there is a different reason to promote the judicial overhaul. I'll start with the ultra-Orthodox because that's actually the easiest to explain. The ultra-Orthodox have hated the Supreme Court of Israel for a long time. And I touched on some of it before because they view the Supreme Court as a liberalizing force in Israeli society that is responsible for a lot of these decisions that are opposed to their beliefs and way of life, right? I mean, a country that gives more rights to women and LGBT and equality to minorities is not exactly their vision for Israel. On top of that, the ultra-Orthodox are afraid of the Supreme Court because they're afraid that the Supreme Court at some point will intervene in the socially explosive question of ultra-Orthodox men receiving an exemption from military service in Israel. Right? If you are a Jewish man or a woman from the secular or traditional or moderately religious sectors of Israeli society, you are obliged by law to serve in the military. I served, my wife served, all of our neighbors here in the kibbutz served. My brother is currently an officer in the military. And there is an entire section of the population, the ultra-Orthodox, who get an automatic exemption from service. It's discriminatory, it's extremely unfair. For a long time, the court has not touched this issue because it has given government after government in Israel a chance to solve it via legislation. And the ultra-Orthodox parties are afraid that at some point the court will intervene and basically blow up their entire way of life that is based on these, yeshivas and educational institutions that don't send their young people to the military. So the ultra-Orthodox have a very clear interest in weakening the judicial system. For the far right, people like Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, and even Yariv Levin, he's a member of Likud, the justice minister, but his ideology is very hard right. This is all about the settlements and the annexation. They want to go forward with very extreme measures in the occupied territories that they believe the Israeli Supreme Court could block. Okay, these are violent, messianic ideas that would create a very different reality on the ground, basically, annexation without giving rights to the Palestinian population in the territories, and creating clear laws that give more rights to the Jewish population than the Palestinian population. They believe the court will block it. They want to weaken the court. Like I said earlier, without a strong Supreme Court to block it, this will become the problem of the United States. The third and perhaps most tragic element is what has happened with Likud, because the far right and ultra-Orthodox have wanted to weaken the court for a very, very long time, but the Likud never allowed it. The Likud historically calls itself the liberal national movement of Israel. It's hawkish on foreign policy, but at least historically viewed itself as more liberal on internal issues within the country. And we all know the famous, here in Israel, we all know the famous saying of Menachem Begin, the mythological leader of Likud, there are justices in Jerusalem. Yesh shoftim b'Yerushalayim, when the court put out a decision that was opposed to his policies and that he did not like. That was the historical position of Likud, and Netanyahu himself embodied it for many years. He used to protect the Supreme Court from all kinds of legislative assaults from the right wing and stop his coalition partners when they tried to weaken the court. And all of that changed when he himself became a criminal defendant. As you know, he's currently facing trial in the Jerusalem District Court for 3 corruption charges. And he has suddenly changed his mind and decided to adopt these far-right ideas that he blocked in the past to weaken the court. So 3 elements of a coalition, each one of them with their own special reason or interest to promote this legislation, and the combination of interests between them, in my opinion, is what makes it so dangerous.
That was a pretty comprehensive answer, but I am interested in your view as well, Michael. What is driving this?
So yeah, Amir's answer covered it, but I want to dig down a bit on one of those 3 elements, which is the settler religious nationalist right, Hatzianut Hadatit, led by Bezalel Smotrich. The judicial overhaul is not an end; it's a means to an end, and for Smotrich and for much of the settlement movement inside of Israel, the things that they have been working for decades, they feel as if they are on the cusp of these things. You know, they are now in the government, not only in the government, but Bezalel Smotrich is both the finance minister and a minister in the defense ministry. In many ways, he is the most important person in this government, given everything that's going on. And for many of the goals that they've had for a long time, they cannot fulfill them, even though they are in these positions of power, if the Israeli Supreme Court remains as it is, if judges are selected how they are, if the rules of the game remain as they are. In the coalition agreements, Bezalel Smotrich secured Likud agreement to do things like retroactively legalize illegal outposts. That's very difficult to do given current Supreme Court rulings. One of the things that Hatzianut Hadatit, religious Zionism, would like to do is to be able to build on private Palestinian land with abandon anywhere in the West Bank. That can happen given current Supreme Court rulings. One of the things Bezalel Smotrich has been doing is to bring many of the authorities in the West Bank out of the hands of the IDF and out of military control and under civilian control. This is something that over time, I don't think the Israeli Supreme Court is going to allow, given that the Supreme Court has defined Israel's presence in the West Bank as a belligerent military occupation, and that brings with it certain responsibilities and requirements. All of these things that the religious right in Israel and the settler movement want to do cannot be done with the Supreme Court there. And they view this as a historic opportunity. They view this as an opportunity to effectively annex the West Bank, certainly in practice, but perhaps in name as well. And they're on the cusp of this historic goal, this historic victory for themselves. And that required judicial overhaul to come first. It's why they lent their support to it. It's why it's being spearheaded by Simcha Rotman, who is a member of Bezalel Smotrich's Hatzianut Hadatit party. And I think that if people focus only on the judicial overhaul and not about what is going to come next, then we are making a mistake and we're missing the bigger picture.
Thank you so much. Well, while we have another few minutes, Amir, I don't want to leave without asking you about a story that you broke just over a week ago about Israeli antiquities found at Mar-a-Lago, potentially in a bathroom. And yet, it appears that they have been returned. Can you, or at least to the Israeli mission in Miami, or consulate in Miami, can you speak a bit about this? I mean, we all know kind of what that bathroom looks like now. I didn't see any Israeli antiquities in there, but who knows? That curtain was closed. How did this story come about? And what else might be at Mar-a-Lago related to Israel?
Oh, well, thank you for that question. I think it's important to also smile a bit when we're discussing such serious issues. Yeah, you know, sometimes the best stories come to you by chance, and honestly, this is how I landed on this story. but I got a tip that there are Israeli archaeological artifacts at Mar-a-Lago and that Israel has failed to return them to Israel. I involved in it my colleague Nir Hasson, who is an amazing reporter for Haaretz, based in Jerusalem, and he also writes a lot of archaeology. We started digging up and we found that indeed there is a story there, and that these were archaeological artifacts that Israel sent to the White House in 2019 when Trump was still president to be presented at a Hanukkah party. And then there were some bureaucratic issues, and instead of returning them immediately to Israel, they got stuck in the US. Then COVID happened and it became much more difficult to send a specialist, because this is not something you just send via regular air. I mean, you know, these are artifacts from 2,000 years ago. You need to pack them in a very specific way, transfer them in under some protocol. It got stuck in the US in the hands of a donor of the Israeli Antiquities Authority, who was also a big donor to Trump and very close to the former president. At some point, this person brought it to Mar-a-Lago. He communicated about it with the Israeli authorities, but there was some kind of a misunderstanding or miscommunication. They thought that they had lost track of these antiquities. Trump, I'm not sure what he thought, how aware he was. Maybe he thought it was a gift or something. But the end of the story is that a few months ago, these Israeli officials from the antiquities world realized that they have artifacts that belong to the treasures of the state of Israel that are stranded in Mar-a-Lago. They tried to contact the former president in several avenues to get them back. Nothing worked. We published the story at Haaretz. It exploded all over the internet, all over the world. I mean, hundreds of news outlets in the US and elsewhere covered it. You know, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. And a good end to the story. You know, the noise made it to former President Trump's desk, and he decided to return these antiquities to Israel, and they are now in the Israeli consulate in Miami, which I think shows you that, you know, the power of the press and especially of Haaretz. So I'm very happy we did this story. And Haley, if I can just add one more sentence, if you know we're ending this on a good and optimistic note. I truly believe what I said earlier about the importance of the Jewish American voice. And if there are people here who want to bring this conversation to their communities, you know, I'll send my email in the chat. Please contact me. I'm not doing this for a commercial purpose. That's not the issue. I think I would love to help to connect you with people in Israel who care about this issue and can explain it well to your communities. It's really important to bring this conversation to the community, to the synagogue, to the Jewish organization, or you know, wherever you are active, because your voice matters. So I'll send it in the chat, and if people want to contact me, I'll be, you know, very happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Amir. That is a great story about the power of journalism on not just this topic, but so many others. And for those who don't follow Amir on Haaretz, you should be reading what he's writing. It's fabulous. Similarly, thank you to Michael. And he puts out really insightful pieces. It's not just once a week. Like, I know you have a column once a week, but quite often on Israel through Israel Policy Forum, and everybody should be reading those as well. So we want to thank both of you for shedding light on what is happening in Israel. And we leave today with a greater sense of clarity and what's to come. Here at JDCA, it's our mission to be the political home and voice of Jewish American voters in support of Democrats who share our core values. And one of those core values is, of course, the defense of our democracy. We hope you'll stay involved with JDCA. We are advocating for policy, educating and mobilizing Jewish voters, and electing those who share our values. So to learn more, you can visit our website at jewishdems.org. Also join us next week. Next Thursday, August 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern, we will host another webinar, this time looking at the fight for democracy here in the United States. We'll be joined by the leading voting rights attorney in the US, Mark Elias, to discuss the recent Supreme Court ruling overturning the Republicans' redistricting efforts in Alabama, what it means for the fight for voting rights, and other measures, including those recently introduced in Congress, to defend the right to vote. So to sign up, you can visit the link in the chat or visit jewishdems.org. So thank you all for spending the afternoon with us. A special thanks to Amir and Michael for sharing their insights with us today. And we hope you're all inspired to continue to fight for democracy in the United States, in Israel, and around the world. And wishing you a Shabbat Shalom. Thanks.